If you ever question the cyclical nature of history, read this book. Different names, different players, but it's the same stuff.
That's right. It's a rerun, you know, sort of in color, stereo sound, but a rerun of the old black and white film that the British made after World War I, when they went into to Mesopotamia, as it was called back then. And it was the crumbling empire of the Ottoman Turks, and from that they assembled Iraq. And though they'd been warned that it was an explosive package they were putting together, putting the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites into one country, these were people who didn't particularly like each other. But the British wanted them all together because they particularly wanted the petroleum that the Kurds had. So they wanted to make the Kurds part of this package. So they were told, you know, you're heading for trouble. And the warnings that came out then, and then the warnings that came out when revolt occurred almost immediately. There were uprisings in 1920, 1921, even as the British were trying to put this thing together. And the Royal Air Force was sent in to bomb and machine gun and strafe the uprising, the villages. And Churchill even asked the RAF to look into using chemical weapons against the uprising. And the warnings that came out back then sound exactly like the Americans and others who warned Bush that he was getting in over his head in Iraq in 2003. But Bush paid no attention, and the British also ultimately paid no attention. They decided to keep their colony, Iraq essentially, and to keep it as it was, and to try to maintain it, which they did by force. The book was generated by Saddam being put on trial by himself, and without foreigners being brought before the bar also. There's no chance to accuse foreigners of complicity in Saddam's crimes, and they have been complicit. And that sort of got me going in it. And though I went into the history of it, what I found most important were the Saddam years and some of the crimes that were committed then, and how America particularly played a role in those crimes. George Bush Sr. made a radio address, and he called on the people of Iraq to rise up and overthrow Saddam. He made that address twice, and it was broadcast across Iraq by the CIA secret radio stations, and also pamphlets. Millions of pamphlets were dropped over Iraq by U.S. fighters planes with that message. So the Iraqis rose up, and it looked like they were going to win because the defeated army started coming over to their side, to the rebel side. But at that point, George Bush got cold feet, George Bush Sr., because he was afraid that Iran might come in and try to take advantage of the situation. The Kurds might break off. Turkey would be upset by that. Chaos in the region, didn't want it. And what they really wanted was a nice, neat military coup. Another strong man would take over in Iraq and sort of follow the wishes of the U.S. this time. But that didn't happen. They really got a popular uprising, democratic, if you want it. And they turned their back on the uprising. They allowed Saddam Hussein to fly his battle helicopters to destroy the villages and towns with machine guns and bombs. Orders were given to American troops who were just a few kilometers away from where the uprisings were going on, not to help. And when the insurgents came to American lines and said, "Look, we need help from you. We don't want you to come and fight for us. Just give us weapons." And the Americans had huge stocks of weapons they had captured from the Iraqi military. Instead, they blew up the weapons on orders from the Pentagon. I was told this by a special forces officer who had been there, rather than turn them over to the rebels.
And some of the weapons they sent to their great allies against the Russians in Afghanistan.
Exactly.
Folks called the Taliban.
Exactly.
Brilliant idea there.
Yeah. And so the rebellion was squashed. About perhaps 150,000 Shiites were massacred by Saddam afterwards. The U.S. did absolutely nothing to stop it. What's scary is that the ability of the Bush administration to continue along its way, despite the fact that the majority of Congress and the people have said they don't want it. And these are the Bush and Cheney, in a way, command the largest military power that the planet has ever known. And they don't seem to be subject to democratic controls at this point. That's the scary thing. I mean, when polls have been taken now in other parts of the world about who foreigners consider the greatest danger to world peace, you know, is it Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, or is it George Bush? And George Bush wins hand down.
The book is Web of Deceit: The History of Western Complicity in Iraq, from Churchill to Kennedy to George W. Bush. I've been speaking with the author, Barry M. Lando, and Web of Deceit, published by Doubleday Canada.